Going to look at both Montesquieu and Locke, simply because both of them, probably more than anyone else um, who had lived in the past, uh, these two probably had the greatest influence on the founders. And that's saying quite a bit when you look at others who certainly had ideas borrowed from them, like Aristotle, Plato, and Hobbes and others. But these two kind of stand out. Now, Montesquieu wrote The Spirit of Laws in 1748, and this work, as much as the treatises by Locke, had an influence on the writing of not only the American Constitution, but also constitutions that followed the American Constitution, which seems to be the basis for so many of the documents that were written in the 19th and 20th century. Now, Montesquieu believed that the laws that underline all things, believed that laws underline all things, be it human, be it natural, or be it divine. And he felt that as a philosopher, one of the major tasks of thought was to discover these laws and how they worked as underlying influences on human, natural, and divine law. Now, if we look at and we break down Montesquieu's take on how government should be formed, he believed that it was difficult to study humanity, number one, because laws governing human nature were really, really complex. And these laws, if you looked at the philosophical approach to these, could be found by empirical or experimental methods of investigation. Now, if and when the knowledge behind these laws could be discovered, then the knowledge derived from the breaking down of the philosophical building blocks of law could and would ease the ills of society and improve life. So therefore, Montesquieu's primary ideas revolve around the interplay between types of government. Now, first and foremost, he thought monarchy was not necessarily a bad thing, but he certainly believed that even in the 18th century, limited power should be placed into king or queen. Much more, his thinking is much more along the lines of the English model, where power was migrating from the throne to parliament, and getting away from the French model, or what would be the German model later on, in which so much power was invested in whoever occupied the throne. So monarchy, limited power placed in a king or queen. He made the recognition, and we all can really agree with it, that aristocracy meant that very few people, or a very limited number of people at the top, wielded power. Certainly, a despotic government can be described as one in which a tyrant wields absolute power. And we know that there were tyrants even back in the time of Aristotle and Plato and Socrates. So, if we look at the three ideas or the types of government that Montesquieu doesn't like, monarchy, aristocracy, and a despotic government, he makes it clear that those are the predominant forms, but they are not the best forms, and they can be the types of government that can evolve into something that is much better for the people who have to live under them. So he looked at the types of government which didn't really exist anywhere, but certainly at one point at Athens had a democracy and power. But he looked at forms of government like a republican government. He said the problem with a republican government, the way that it was looked at in 1748, it was that power could be wielded either as a democracy like in Athens, or it could certainly be power that an aristocracy could wield. But then what have you improved upon if, as he says, in an aristocracy, few people wield power? Now, in a democracy, he felt all had power to some degree. We all could determine the fate of government actions and those who run the government. He said, but in order to do that, you had to have a different type of system in place, and we had to start, in a sense, with legal systems. And legal systems could not be a one-size-fits-all model, but legal systems should vary according to the basic type of government. And he lived in a French system in which you are guilty until proven innocent, but he certainly could look across the channel and see a British system that was different, in which people are innocent until proven guilty. And there were probably quasi-systems all over the place that used a measure of one or the other as they evolved. But he wasn't in favor of a one-size-fits-all model. When it came to political liberty, he said that would involve the separating of the legislative, executive, and judicial powers of government, to put all of those into the hands of one branch would not guarantee that democracy would last or that political liberty would exist. Hence, the founders took a look at his writing on political liberty and his mantra, basically, that there should be separate powers for each of the branches of government, was something that we definitely used, or the founders definitely used, as a model. And consequently, we have legislative, executive, judicial branches of the government, each involving separate powers. Now, he also commented on domestic tranquility, that in order to have democracy and political liberty, men or a man could not and should not be afraid of another in making decisions or making his opinion known. And he also recognized the fact that this would be tempting in so many ways, that someone who becomes an executive and wields executive power would then usurp the powers of the legislative branch. And he said, if you have the legislative and executive powers placed in the same person, then you can't have liberty. So, to wrap up Montesquieu's take on it, in order to obtain liberty, all branches must be separated into separate entities: executive, legislative, and judicial branches. And look what we have in our Constitution. Article 1 is the legislative branch. Article 2 is the executive branch. Article 3 is the judicial branch. All of them are not only separate, but all of them have unique powers. So that's our look at Montesquieu. And that's probably what about as deep as the College Board would need you to go in recognizing the influences of Montesquieu on the founders. Now, when it comes to John Locke, you know that John Locke was a British philosopher. You guys have read his treatises. He wrote in a time of transition. Now, we know that all during his lifetime, power slowly moved from the monarchy to parliament. But Locke went in kind of a different direction than perhaps Montesquieu. This was the age of enlightenment, and therefore,